If you've ever wanted to become a pancake making savant, you've come to the right place. In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys the entire process for how I made the model, texturing, and animation as well. Before we get started, I just want to say also that you guys can get this file completely for free on my Gumroad in the description below, so check that out. Let's get into it. The first thing I do is add a sphere and cut off a significant portion of the bottom vertices. I then extrude down from the outer edge and then extrude in using ES to fill in the bottom. I then add a bunch of edge loops with Ctrl R to the center. I hit Alt S on the center one with proportional editing enabled to scale it in. After that, I hit Ctrl 1 to add a subdivision surface modifier to smooth things out. I then use proportional editing to adjust some of the vertices in the center to give the pancake a more wobbly and realistic look. After that, I added a displace modifier and switched the coordinates to object. And I then added an empty and created a new texture. The empty is going to be what drives the texture coordinates. I then add a sunlight and go into shader editor. I add a gradient texture which we're going to be using for the base color. I recommend using a beige type of color. Using a color ramp node, I'm able to adjust exactly what colors I want, and using a mix node in between the mapping and the gradient allows me to add noise to the gradient. So yeah, feel free to adjust it to whatever your taste buds desire, I guess. And yeah. I then also add a glossy BSDF, which we're going to use for adding a specular reflection. I add a bump map to it as well so that I can make the reflection a bit more stylized and jumbled up. I also add a hue saturation value node to make some slight adjustments, and also a couple RGB nodes to make even further changes to the color levels. I add another glossy BSDF, which I'm going to be using for the main tune shading, and use a multiply node to combine things together. Finally, I added a gradient texture at the end, adding a little bit more of gradation to the model so it achieves a nicer look. That pretty much concludes the shader for the pancake. I then start stacking the pancakes on top of one another like I'm playing Jenga. You'll probably have to adjust the scale of each one in order to get it to look nice, and as you can see, some of them I'm scaling with S-Shift-Z to scale in, and some of them I scale using only Z to make it thinner or thicker. Next, to add a raspberry, I just add a sphere and do some basic operations with proportional editing. The gist of this is basically you want to look at pictures of raspberries and just kind of try and recreate their form. So you'll notice that at the top, for example, it's a lot more hollow there, which is why I put the vertices down in that area. And I also scaled out the raspberry so that it's, I guess, a bit thicker. I also added displace modifier again, this time using Voronoi texture because it gives a nice circular bump. From there you can make more minor adjustments until you get the shape that you like. I then add the shader and start by making a basic tune shader with a diffuse BSDF. I add a bump map to this one as well, but this time I use a Voronoi texture as the bump map, so that our model has these fake bumpy circles that look like raspberry circles. I forgot to record a little here, but I also added a red gradient using the screen node. After that, I added the blueberry. First, I add a sphere and then I cut a hole in the top of it. From that hole, I basically shape it into sort of a star that's characteristic of what blueberries look like from the top. After being done with that, I select all the edges of the star and extrude downwards. I also inset the face that we extruded down with the I key to make the shading a bit more good looking. After that, I add another displace modifier like we have before multiple times. I then start the shader, and once again, I just start off with a basic tune shader. I add a gradient, which I then add some effects to, like using noise to mess it up a bit, and then I use this gradient to make certain areas darker, as you can see with the hue saturation value node. Basically, the darker areas in this gradient are going to be a darker blue, and the lighter areas are going to be a lighter blue. After that, I then add a glossy BSDF to add a reflection again, and I use a bump map as well once again. And I also added an RGB curves node to adjust the colors a little bit. And that basically concludes the blueberry, and in the end, I change its colors to be a little bit darker. I also should mention that remember to change the coordinates to object for the displace modifier. Over here, what I'm doing now is I'm adding a black outline to each object. Basically, what it's called a solidify outline, and the way it works is you just add a solidify modifier and set it to the settings that you see me putting here. And basically what you want to do is you want to make a new material that's just going to be a completely black color, and you want to move that material above in the material slot so that it's at the top. And then from there, basically, when you slide the thickness of that new solidify modifier that we added, it'll add a black outline to your model. Next, I wanted to add the syrup. For this, I use a simple plane, which I then extrude around the model. You want to try and encapsulate the zigzag shape that the pancakes kind of make. Like as the syrup would fall down, it would have a certain shape, so you just want to make that. I also scaled out this puddle to make it a bit bigger once it reaches the plate. I add some modifiers like solidify and subdivision so that it can get some thickness. For the shader, it's nothing that crazy. I use a glossy BSDF at the beginning, and it might be a little confusing, but basically what I did here was I made it so that the black part of the color ramp uses the transparent BSDF beige color, while the white part of the color ramp is just a pure white color, which acts as a specular reflection. I then add a mix shader again and just combine it with a pure transparency node, which then lets me adjust how transparent I want the syrup to be. I also changed the previous transparency node to have a glossy BSDF that goes into it, and that basically just allows the syrup to have a more watery look. I then add a displace modifier and begin duplicating the syrup around. You can duplicate the syrups on top of each other if you want, and that'll basically give it a more opaque look. You'll see me do that later. As I duplicate them around, you might see me scaling them in as well. What I do is I basically hit S and then I think either YY or XX. Basically what it does is it just scales it in the local X or the local Y axis, depending on which you double tap. Finally, it was time to add the butter. This was just a simple plane that I added some loop cuts to, and then added a solidify modifier and a subdivision surface modifier. I added a basic diffuse BSDF and a glossy BSDF to make the shader for this, so it's very simple and not any different from what we did previously. You can also duplicate certain parts of the syrup to give it a less transparent look. Like, for example, I duplicate the faces in the puddle area so that it looks like it's pooling more and it becomes a bit darker in that area. Finally, to animate everything, I simply just insert keyframes for the location of the empties that we made for the displace modifiers. On the timeline, once you place your keyframes, hit T and set it to linear interpolation, and hit Shift E and set it to linear extrapolation. Linear interpolation will make it so that there's no ease in and ease out, and the linear extrapolation will make it so that the animation goes on forever and doesn't stop. If you want to decrease or increase speed, just change the distance between the two keyframes, and the linear extrapolation will automatically update the speed. Moving them further apart makes the animation slower, and moving them closer together makes the animation faster. And yeah, you're pretty much done after that. Obviously, this was a remake. I already made this model and animation like many months ago, and I was just making this video to show you guys the overall process, but yeah, hope you guys learned something in this walkthrough. Also, for those of you who are more serious about learning and really want to become good at this style, I recommend checking out ukiyogirls.io if you want in-depth step-by-step tutorials. I'll show you the exact process for making this anime portrait from scratch, as well as a rigged full body character including texturing the body and just everything else. I'll also show you the full process for making this koi pond model in animation, as well as the sunflower one. You'll learn about sculpting the body, texturing, and making effective shaders that give off that wow factor, even if you have no prior experience. You'll also learn about my layered method, which is basically the process I've developed over years of trial and error to basically guarantee that my works look good through observation, as observation is a skill constantly overlooked, but yet it's so critically important in making good looking models. Not only that, but you'll be given access to our Discord community, where you can ask me whatever you want about art, and you'll also be given access to both my add-ons that I've developed and are normally paid. So if you want a place where you can learn at your own pace and save yourself from making unnecessary mistakes, check out ukiyogirls.io.